been recently going back over the prologue of a Game of Thrones, which we all know is infamous. They use it in the show for the cold open of these others coming down and attacking men of the Night's Watch. And Sir Waymar gets into a sword fight in the prologue, and a very minor sentence is read in this prologue that I think we kind of have glanced over at times. And it's one that I caught, I think, on my third reread of the series. And I've always kind of kept it in the back of my mind. It recently got kind of jostled a little bit when me and you were talking about the fact that we're not sure what the others are, meaning that, like, do they have culture? Do they have language? And we did talk about in the prologue how they have their own tongue. And they obviously have kind of like a chain of command, and they're very menacing. They have laughter, even like they have emotions. They're not just like ice zombies as they are presented in the show. So we're at the point in the prologue here, what I'm going to read, where Sir Waymar is bravely fighting, essentially, the White Walkers. Sir Waymar met him bravely. Dance with me then. He lifted his sword high over his head, defiant. His hands trembled from the weight of it, or perhaps from the cold. Yet in that moment, Will thought, he was a boy no longer, but a man of the Night's Watch. This is the important part. The other halted. Will saw its eyes, deeper blue than any of humans' eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword, trembling on high. Watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. So the other, we get this description of the eyes, but where do the eyes go? They go to the sword that is raised above Waymar's head. Let me ask you, these others are coming south. These others are attacking the Night's Watch. We don't know their motivations, but we do know a little bit of a prophecy about Azor Ahai and the flaming blade. Why did this other take the time to stop and fix his eyes on the sword? There's speculation that maybe it was looking for the sword carried by Azor Ahai. And it's like, is that it? It's not. And then they proceed to kill Waymar. And he loses the duel. But and I know this sounds like a little tinfoil, but I don't think so. I think everything in this prologue, like, one thing about prologues is generally they're very disjointed from stories, and they're full of foreshadowing and connections, especially with George. I mean, we have the Sphinx and a Feast for Crows, and A Clash of Kings obviously hints at Melisandre and the power of R'hllor. And in this one, the other halted. Will saw its eyes, blue, deeper, and bluer than any human's eyes, a blue that burned like ice. They fixed on the longsword trembling on high, and watched the moonlight running cold along the metal. For a heartbeat he dared to hope. It almost seems like the others are looking for a certain sword here. And I think that this kind of plays into what me and you have been talking about with the others and everything that we have to try to figure out, wait for these answers from George. But I don't know. What do you think?
We talked about this last time. We just sort of viewed the others as they seem, at least in the books, more intelligent. But yeah, I've never looked at that line and thought about them potentially looking for Azor Ahai. So maybe that is one of the reasons that they are marching now, is because they believe that the new Azor Ahai is out there.
I think they're looking for Lightbringer. I think they checked his sword to be like, is this Lightbringer? Is this the sword that put us back last time? You know what I mean? Like, what are we up against here? And they kind of laugh after this. Like, they fight Waymar, and it's almost like they even say in the prologue, they use the word mocking. So like they're using a mocking tongue, which we obviously don't know what they're saying, but they're mocking, they're laughing. So like maybe they know there's only one sword that could make them turn around, maybe tuck their tail between their legs and fight another day, and that would be Lightbringer. So like, right. I just think it's fascinating because like we need to figure out why they're coming south. We need to figure out what their motivation is and what their side of the story is even. So whenever I caught on to this, and like I said recently, kind of jostled my memory to go back to this, really, really cool stuff. Tying in, Lightbringer, which we don't hear. I don't think we hear about until Clash of Kings, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, this was one of the bigger things.
Lightbringer is the opening of, because it's the Melisandre.
That's right.
Each scene.
So, I don't know. It's pretty incredible. And I think the others kind of cross blades in a way to kind of test that sword, and the sword is destroyed. And then that's whenever they start mocking Waymar. Poor Waymar. But I do think every word matters, especially in the prologue of the opening of the series. So just an interesting thing. It shows you that we can read these things over and over and over again and still find new stuff. And I'm here for it. I love it.
A shadow emerged in front of the dark of the wood. It stood in front of Royce. Tall it was and gaunt and hard as old bones, with flesh pale as milk. Its armor seemed to change color as it moved. Here it was white as new fallen snow, then black as shadow, everywhere dappled with deep gray green of the trees. The pattern ran like moonlight on water with every step it took. So, like that's something too, when you sort of look at these things. I know sometimes when we go backwards, we're not thinking like I'll just reference what you just said, right? Like Lightbringer, or Lightbringer doesn't show up until a Clash of Kings. So here, really like studying this chapter, this prologue again, you're sort of reminded of some of these things that we didn't even know existed at this point. But now you can go back and you're like, okay, well, why do they say it looks like the green of trees? And what's the significance there of green and trees and potentially green seers? When we just did our dive into the Long Night, one of the things it talked about was when the Long Night came, you had giants and ice spiders, and cold servants was a word. And so you're kind of thinking, okay, well, what exactly are cold servants? Is cold hands a cold servant? Does that mean that Bloodraven and the Three-Eyed Crow, which totally different in the books, is a servant of the cold? There's a big difference.
Yeah.
When you look at some of these things.
There really is, and there's always more context to be had, and like we know that Winds of Winter is going to hold a lot more of the brand and the lore and the others, and we might get a whole nother side of this thing.
Right.
It's also worth noting that Royce is of the old blood. He is closer to the Starks than he is away from them, right? I mean, he's pretty close, and the old gods. So like, who's to say that they don't know that Jon Snow is the one? Maybe they have prophecies as well. And Waymar is very handsome, kind of has a little bit of a Stark look to him as well. And not to mention that they probably know that Valyrian steel obviously can harm them. And when the sword breaks, it would make sense that they would mock him after, because Valyrian steel wouldn't shatter.
Right. There is the one scene in the show, and again, that's it. It's total showism, where Jon fights the White Walker at Hardhome, the other, either way, at Hardhome, which will not take place because Hardhome's going on currently, or will take place probably at the beginning of Winds of Winter, and Jon isn't there like he is in the show. But when that takes place, what ends up happening is, remember, Jon and that White Walker are fighting, and the White Walker and Jon's blades, because the White Walker has like a spear and Jon has his sword, they hit, and then remember they sort of bounce off. And the White Walker's like shook, right? I mean, he's sort of shook of like, what just happened? And then Jon kills him.
Yeah, it feels like in the book, at least the way I'm choosing to interpret it, it almost feels like the others are more aware of the circumstances. You know what I mean? Like, and the fact that they're not, again, just kind of like mute of emotion, I'm just here to kill you, ice zombie. I think it definitely, I imagine the others have prophecies and a religion and everything else. Like, I think they're probably a pretty fleshed out culture and a group of people. So, or maybe not people, but whatever they are, the others. Yeah, I think that I think this is pretty wild stuff. The fact that one sentence can send you down a whirlwind.